Isn't summing up a man's life a kind of prayer? After 3 years in prison, he had learned to pass the time with whatever was at hand. But for the first 10 minutes, he smoked a cigarette without thinking of any game to play. It was only when he threw the cigarette end down on the gravel drive that it struck him. The number of little stones in the various drives and garden paths was a finite number. Even the number of grains of sand in all the beaches in the world was a finite number that could be calculated, however large it was. And so, staring down at the ground, he started to count. In 5 square centimeters, there might be an average of 80 stones. So he calculated visually the area of all the drives and paths that led to the villa ahead of him, and concluded that all the gravel in all the drives, which seemed infinite, consisted of a mere 1,600,000 stones, with a 10% margin of error. Then, suddenly, there was a crunching sound on the gravel, and he lifted his head for a moment. A man had emerged from the villa and was coming along the biggest drive towards him. Now that the man had appeared, he had time to play a game. So, sitting on that small concrete shelf that functioned as a bench, he leaned forward and picked up a handful of stones. The game consisted of guessing 2 things. 1, if the number of stones was an odd or even number, and 2, if that number was higher or lower than a chosen number, 20 for example. To win, you had to guess both things. He estimated that he had an even number of stones in his fist, and a number lower than 20. He opened his fist and counted. He had won. There were 18 stones. "I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting, Dr. Lamberti." The man had come to level with him, and his voice was solemn and tired, the voice of a weary emperor. Leaning forward like that, Duca saw only the man's legs, thin legs inside narrow trousers, a young man's trousers, although the man wasn't young, as he was as soon as he got up to shake the hand he was holding out. He was a middle-aged man, little but powerful. His hair shaved to almost nothing, his beard shaved down to the root, his hand also little, but with a grip of steel. "Good evening," he said to the little emperor. "Pleased to meet you." In prison, he had learned not to say more than he needed to. At his trial, while Signora Maldragotti's niece was crying over her murdered aunt, but omitting to mention the millions that she had inherited from the same aunt, he had wanted to speak, but his defense lawyer, almost with tears in his eyes, had whispered in his ear that he shouldn't say a word, not one. He would tell the truth, and the truth is death. Anything but the truth in a courtroom, at a trial, or in life. "It's very hot in Milan," the little man said, and sat down next to him on the concrete bench. "Here in Brianza, on the other hand, it's always cool. Do you know the Brianza?" He couldn't have called him here to talk about the weather in Brianza. He was just building up to it. "Yes," he replied. "As a boy, I used to come here by bicycle. Canso, Asa, the lake." "By bicycle," the little man said. "I used to come here by bicycle too when I was young." The conversation seemed to be over. In the dusk, the garden was almost dark. Some lights went on in the villa. A bus passed on the main road 20 meters below the villa, its horn sounding almost like a piece by Wagner. "It's gone out of fashion these days," the little man resumed. "They all chase the sun on the French Riviera or the islands, whereas here in the Brianza, only a half-hour's drive from Milan, the air is as clear as if you were in Tahiti. I think it's because people always want to go a long way from where they are. A place is never beautiful if it's too close. My son regards this villa as a kind of punishment cell. Whenever I tell him to come here, he does it as a penance. Maybe he's right. It may be cooler, but it's a bit boring." It was almost dark now. The lighted windows in the villa were the only light. In a different voice, the little man said, "Were you told why I wanted to see you, Dr. Lamberti?" "No," Duca said. He had been told. What he had been told, though, was who this man who seemed so modest, so simple, really was. one of the Magnificent Five. In other words, one of the top 5 engineers in the field of plastics. Engineer Pietro Asseri, late 50s, a man who could create anything out of anything. A special kind of plastic was named after him, Alcerolo. He had 3 degrees. His fortune must be considerable, but officially he was only a freelance engineer with an old office in an old street in Milan. I thought they would have told you, the little man said. The tiredness had gone from his voice. Only the authority remained. He had clearly said all he had to say on the topics of the weather and tourism. All I was told was that you might have a job for me, Duca said. It was dark now. More lights came on in the villa. A dim trail of light reached as far as the spot where they were. Yes, in a way it's a job, Alceri said. Do you mind if we talk here? My son's in the house and I don't want you to see him until after we've talked. That's fine by me. He liked this little middle-aged man. He was no fool. Over the past few years inside prison and out, Duca had seen whole armies of fools, and he could almost tell them from the smell, from a finger, from a single hair in the eyebrows. You're a doctor, Asseri said. He didn't reply immediately, but a few moments later, and in that darkness, in that silence, it was a long pause. I'm sure you were told. Certainly, Asseri said, but you're still a doctor, and I need a doctor. Duca counted the windows in the villa. There were 8 of them, 4 on the ground floor and 4 on the first floor. I can't practice anymore. I can't even give injections, especially not injections, weren't you told? I was told everything, but it doesn't matter. Curious. If you need a doctor, Duca said, and choose one who's been struck off the register and can't even prescribe an aspirin, then it must matter a bit. No, the Emperor said, politely but authoritatively. In the darkness, he held out a packet of cigarettes. Do you smoke? I even spent 3 years in prison. He took a cigarette from, and Alceri lit it for him. For murder. I know, Alceri said, but it doesn't matter. Then maybe nothing really mattered. My son is an alcoholic, Alceri said in the darkness, smoking. He's in that room on the first floor right now, the only lighted window on the first floor. That's his room. He must have managed to hide a few bottles of whiskey from me, and he's tanking himself up while he's waiting for us. From his voice, it was obvious that his son didn't matter all that much to him either. He's 22, Asseri said, 2 meters tall and weighs, I think, 90 kilos. Up until last year, he didn't worry me too much. The only thing that made me a bit sad was that he wasn't very bright. I couldn't send him to university. I only managed to get him through his high school exams by bribing his teachers. He's also very shy and submissive. To be honest, he's a big lump. In other words, tall and stupid. Alceri's bitter voice seemed to come from out of nowhere. It somehow just materialized in the dark air. I wasn't too upset that he was like that, Alceri said. I don't care about the joy of having a genius as a son may bring. When he was 19, I sent him to work for Montecatini. He went through all the offices and departments so that he could learn. He didn't learn much, but he kept going. Then last year he started drinking. For the first few months he managed to hide his vice. Then he started going in late to work or not going at all. Then I had to keep him at home because he was going into work with whiskey bottles, the flat kind, in his pocket. You're listening, aren't you? Oh yes. In prison he had learned to listen. His cellmates all had long stories to tell. Lies, of course. Stories about how they were innocent, about how they'd been ruined by women. Every one of them was an Abel killed by a Cain or an Adam corrupted by Eve. The engineer, though, was telling him something different, something sadder, more meaningful. And he was really listening. Of course, he replied. I need to explain a lot of things so that you'll understand, Alceri said. In the darkness, his voice did not lose any of its authority, but rather became more stubborn. My son gets drunk 3 times a day. By lunchtime, he's completely drunk. He doesn't eat anything and falls asleep. In the afternoon, he gets drunk a second time, then sleeps until dinner time. At dinner, he eats, but he begins with the 3rd course and falls asleep in his chair. That's what he's been doing for most of the past year, unless I physically prevented him. For a 22-year-old, it was a worrying way of drinking. You must have tried a lot of things to stop him from drinking. He couldn't yet figure out what was wanted of him, but he was making an effort to be polite. Keep him away from whichever friends of his are making him drink. My son doesn't have any friends, Alseri said. He's never had any, not even in elementary school. He's an only child. I was widowed 11 years ago. Busy as I've been with my work, I've never abandoned him to tutors or governesses. I know him well. He's never played tennis with anyone. He's never gone to the swimming pool, to the gym, or to the dance with friends. Since he's had his car, he's only used it for drives along the autostrada. The only normal thing about him is that he likes driving fast. One of these days he'll kill himself, and his alcohol problem will be solved. Duca waited for the bitter emperor to start speaking again. He had to wait a long time. I did a lot of things to stop him drinking. Alseri was in expository mode now, as if listing the sections of a disastrous balance sheet. The first method was persuasion, talking to him. I've never in my life known anybody to be persuaded of anything with words, but I had to try. Psychologists say young people need to be persuaded, not controlled, but my attempts at persuasion were all defeated by the whiskey. I talked and he drank. Then I tried the restrictive method. No money, maximum surveillance. I was with him for almost 2 weeks without ever leaving him alone. We were in Saint Moritz. We passed the hours looking at the swans on the lake with our umbrellas in our hands because it rained all the time, and he managed to drink all the same. He drank all night because we slept in separate rooms. Somebody working in the hotel must have brought him something to drink without my knowledge, and by the morning he was blind drunk. Every now and again they looked at the only lighted window on the 1st floor, the drinker's room, though all you could see was the light, the play of light on the ceiling. The 3rd method didn't give any better results, Alseri said. I'm a great believer in corporal punishment. Slaps and punches force a man to think fast about the best way to avoid them. Every time I found my son drunk, I'd hit him, a lot, and hard. My son respects me, and even if he'd tried to rebel, I would have crushed him. After that corporal punishment, my son would cry and try to tell me that it wasn't his fault, that he didn't want to drink but couldn't stop himself. After a while, I abandoned that method too. Have you tried any others? No. I did call a doctor and talk to him about the matter, and he told me that the only way was to put my son in a detox clinic. Yes, it was true. In a clinic, they would detoxify the young man, and then as soon as he got out, he would probably start drinking again. But he didn't say this. Alseri did. I'd already thought of putting him in the clinic, but when he comes out, he'll only start drinking again. As soon as he's alone, he starts drinking. He needs friends. He needs women. Alseri offered him another cigarette and lit it, and they started smoking. The air was still damp. Now it was also dark, apart from the lighted windows at the end of the drive. Especially women. I've never known him to have a girlfriend. Don't get me wrong, he likes women. I can tell that from the way he looks at them. And I believe he often uses prostitutes, but he's too introverted to get a girlfriend. I've seen girls run after him. He's a good match after all. But he clams up when he's with a woman. He literally never opens his mouth. He may give the impression of not being normal, but that's wrong. He did the whole of his military service, and as a private, not as an officer. At first his companions teased him because he always kept to himself. He almost broke one fellow's head and cracked another's ribs. After that they respected him and left him alone. My son is normal. He just takes after his mother. She was like that too. She had no friends or even acquaintances. She was quite happy to stay at home with me. I only ever managed to take her to receptions or parties a few times. Defects can be inherited, whereas qualities are recessive. It's a kind of biological entropy. The little emperor waved a hand, unhappily, but in the darkness it almost didn't seem like a living hand. It appeared as vague and phosphorescent as ectoplasm, and even more unhappy in that funereal darkness. And now I'd like to make one last attempt, Alceri said. Put him together with someone who could be both friend and doctor, who'd use any method he wanted to make him stop drinking, who'd stop him physically every minute of the day, even in the toilet. I don't care if it takes a year or what means he uses. He could even beat him to death. I'd rather he was dead than an alcoholic. In prison, you can actually become intelligent, and words mean a lot. The words you say and those you listen to. Outside, where you were free to say what you liked, words and listening to words were wasted, underestimated. People spoke without knowing what they were saying, and listened without understanding. But with Alceri, it wasn't like that. That was why Duca liked him, apart from the pain and bitterness concealed within the imperious exterior. He said, "You want me to be that person who's both a friend and a doctor, and who gets him off the drink?" "Yes, the idea came to me yesterday. Superintendent Karua is a friend of mine. He knows the whole story. I had to go to police headquarters yesterday, and I dropped by his office. He talked to me about you, and asked me if I could find you a job with Montecatini. Of course I could find you a desk job with Montecatini if you wanted it. But then it struck me that someone like you could help me with my son." Of course, someone who's only been out of prison for 3 days helps everyone, does everything, sings any song. He was certainly lucky to be a friend of Superintendent Karua's. He already had many things to choose from. Karua had also found him a job selling pharmaceuticals. It was the ideal profession for a doctor who had been struck off, a suitcase with samples, a car with Ciba and Farmitalia painted on the doors, driving around the region, calling on doctors and pharmacists. It was almost better than being a doctor yourself. Or if he preferred something more unusual, he could accept Engineer Alceri's offer and devote himself to his alcoholic son, cure him, remove the poison from him, be a kind of social worker. Or if he had lost the taste for socially redeeming work, he could make sure that Alceri got him that position with Montecatini, a desk somewhere in one of those neat offices. He could gratify his small-minded selfishness, the inertia of a man who no longer believes in anything. But in prison you also become sensitive, easily irritated. And because he was irritated now, he said calmly, "What made you think of me? Any other doctor could treat your son." "I don't think so," Alceri said. He had become irritated too. "I need a person I can trust absolutely. From the way Superintendent Karua spoke to me about you, I know I can trust you. I have an intuition about these things. Earlier, when I saw you sitting here with those stones in your hands, I knew I could trust you." These weren't empty words. He could hear it in the tone of Alceri's voice, and his irritation vanished. He liked talking to a man, after having talked to so many fools. The director of the clinic in the beanie hat, who told dirty jokes as he operated, the prosecuting lawyer who shook his head each time he uttered Duca's name in his closing statement. "I don't understand how Dr. Duca Lamberti," a shake of the head, "can maintain such an absurd version of events. Dr. Duca Lamberti," a shake of the head, "is either more naive or more cunning than may appear. Dr. Duca Lamberti," another shake of the head. "How could anyone be such an idiot?" Alceri, though, was a man, and he liked listening to him. "Any other doctor would take advantage of the situation and drum up publicity for himself," Alceri said. "Until now, my son's alcoholism has been closely guarded secret, known only to a few discreet friends. With any other doctor, it would become an item of gossip in all the drawing rooms of Milan. But you won't talk. and I know that if you accept the job, you'll get it done. Another doctor would get bored after a week and leave the boy stuffed full of pills and injections, and he'll get drunk anyway. I don't want pills and injections. I want a friend and an inflexible guardian for my son. It's my final attempt. If it doesn't work, I'll let him go. I'll cut him off and wash my hands of him. Now it was his turn. What time was it? And where were they? In a damp, dark corner of the Brianza, on the side of a hill, with a villa ahead that seemed to be sliding towards them, and inside the villa a young man clinging to a bottle of whiskey. That was where they were. I need to ask you a few questions, he said. Of course, Alceri said. You say your son has been drinking like this for a year. Did he drink before, or did he just suddenly start drinking? No, he drank before as well, but not very often. He'd get drunk 2 or 3 times a month, no more than that. I don't want to be ungenerous towards his dead mother, but it's a tendency he gets from her. You also told me your son has no friends, no girlfriends. Does that mean he usually drinks alone? He's drinking alone right now in his room, but he drinks alone because he's never with anybody. He doesn't want to be. You said that, despite appearances, your son is a normal young man. I'm prepared to believe that. But a normal young man doesn't start drinking in that way without a reason. Something may have happened to him that drove him to drink more than he did before. He may not have got involved with a woman, for example. In films, men drink to forget unhappy love affairs. Alceri's hand rose again, floated in the dark, and moved across his face. That was what I asked him when I hit him with the poker. We have a fireplace in our apartment in Milan, an old-fashioned one with a poker. A poker on the face hurts, and as it happened quite recently, you can still see the mark on his cheek. I asked him if there was a woman, if he was in debt because he'd had to pay for some underage girl to have an abortion. He said no, and I believe him, because he's useless, even at doing something wrong. He must be a strange young man. I'm sorry to insist, engineer. I'm speaking now as a doctor. As an ex-doctor, of course. A doctor who's been struck off. You told me before that as far as women are concerned, your son doesn't have girlfriends. He's always turned to prostitutes. Given this habit, it's possible he's contracted what he thinks of as a terrible disease, and in his desperation, considering himself human, refused has started drinking. Syphilis is a less fearsome disease now than it was in the past, but it's still a stigma, and a sensitive young man like your son could well find it traumatic. In the darkness, Alceri said, that was the first thing I suspected. And 4 months ago I had him see a doctor. He was given all kinds of tests. He's in perfect health, no infection at all, not even the most commonplace. So not even the fear of disease was driving young Alceri to drink. But what does your son say? What excuse does he give? My son is humiliated and desperate. He says he doesn't want to drink but can't help himself. Whenever I hit him, he says to me, you're right, and starts crying. It was time for Duca to make up his mind. Have you told your son about me? Certainly. Alceri used that word often, which coming from him meant that he was absolutely sure. He wasn't wasting his breath. I told him that a doctor I really trust might agree to help him, and he promised me that he'll do whatever you want. Even if he hadn't promised, I'd have made him do it all the same. Naturally, or even certainly. What should he do? This wasn't a job. It was shaping up to be a right old mess, but the idea of being a pharmaceutical salesman, when he thought about it, did rather turn his stomach. He tried to be calm, not to become irritated with himself. I don't think it'll be difficult to stop your son from drinking. In little more than a month, you can have him teetotal again. What will be difficult, if not impossible, is to stop him starting again, as soon as he's free. Alcoholism is a symptom here. If we don't find the cause, we'll be back to square one. Start by making him teetotal, and then we'll see. All right, I'm ready. It was time to meet this victim of alcohol. Thank you. But Alceri did not get up. He looked for something in his pockets. If it's all right with you, I want to leave him in your hands immediately and not have to deal with him again. I've been watching him for a month and I'm exhausted. Seeing him drunk from morning to night is depressing. I've written this check for you, and there's some cash, too, to cover your first expenses. I'll hand my son over to you now, and then I'm going straight back to Milan. I have to be in Pavia by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. I've already neglected my work long enough for him. Do whatever you want. You have carte blanche. In the darkness, he couldn't tell the check from the cash. It was just a little wad of papers of a certain thickness. And Duca put them in his pocket. Engineer Alceri was well aware that people who are just out of prison don't have very much to fall back on. Let's go. They started climbing towards the villa. When they entered, a young man stood up somewhat unsteadily from an armchair, but managed to stay on his feet without swaying. The living room of the villa was small, too small for him. It was like a doll's house with him inside, not a real villa. My son David, Dr. Duca Lamberti.